Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jennifer Hill, and I'm a biologist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center. Before introducing our guest speakers, I would like to acknowledge that NCTC is located in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, in the homeland of the Massachusetts Nation, and for that we give thanks. Today, we are going to hear about the importance of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's cultural resources to Native American heritage from Timothy Binzen and Eugene Marino. Timothy Binzen's professional background is in archaeology and anthropology. When he was a child, his British grandparents encouraged his interest in ancient sites in Great Britain. They took him to Stonehenge, Roman villa excavations, and Bronze Age hill forts. During his childhood summers in northwestern Connecticut, his family lived off the grid in a one-room cabin. Timothy spent his days in the woods or in a canoe on the lake or picking blueberries and observing the weather and wildlife. Timothy has worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 11 years, first in the Northeast Region's Cultural Resources Program, and then as Regional Tribal Liaison since 2017. Before joining the service, he worked for more than 2 decades in archaeological consulting and gained a wide range of field experiences in Idaho, New Mexico, and New England. Timothy has had many opportunities to work in consultation with tribal members. In his current role, he finds it rewarding to advise his service colleagues on the tribal trust responsibility. Timothy says, when you work with tribes, history comes alive every day. It is not something abstract. We'll also hear from Eugene Marino, who is the Chief Archaeologist and Federal Preservation Officer and the National Museum Curator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He is in their headquarters office and has held this position since 2003. Eugene serves as the National Cultural Resources and Museum Collections subject matter expert for the service, responsible for advising service leadership on issues relating to historic preservation, archaeological compliance, and museum curation and management. He is also the national liaison with the service regional archaeologists and curators, and has developed and launched interactive asynchronous online courses for Section 108 compliance in the service. Since 2007, Eugene has been an adjunct professor for Shepherd University, teaching anthropology and archaeology courses. He routinely lectures on historic preservation for the Department of the Interior and often serves as an instructor for Section 106 training courses offered by other bureaus and agencies. Tim, Eugene, welcome, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. And thanks everyone. I appreciate being here today. I think it's an honor to gather and talk about Native Americans and their contributions to cultural resources. In my position, I spend a lot of time looking at how the service can meet its responsibilities towards executing proper cultural resource compliance. As many may or may not know, consultation with Native Americans has a long history within the federal government, and especially with respect to cultural resources. Our consultation with Native American tribes accounts for a large percentage of consultation that occurs within the Fish and Wildlife Service. And that's a unique responsibility and an important responsibility. And it's been a great pleasure to work with the agency as a federal preservation officer to help engage in that consultation, develop policy to address that consultation and our larger cultural resources, heritage resources responsibilities.
Thanks, Eugene. Yeah, it's always important to think about how those we have our policies and regulations, but they really how we implement them, especially with the tribal trust responsibility, it really plays out on the ground in within the refuge system in many important ways. I have a story to share about my experience and awareness that I gained about the Native American heritage in the refuge system. But first, I want to mention that I am speaking to you all today from the traditional homelands of the Pecumtuck and Nipmuc tribes, and I acknowledge those ancestors of these lands, but also I respect the living descendants, and I think of them in my approach to my work and to the world. As Jen mentioned, before I started working for the Fish and Wildlife Service, my background's in archaeology, and I worked for more than 20 years in archaeological consulting in Idaho, New Mexico, but mostly in New England and in the Northeast. And in my work in the Northeast, I participated in hundreds of archaeological field surveys in all kinds of different landscapes and settings. And part of our work was to identify, historic properties and Native American archaeological sites in the project areas where we were working for our clients. And it was, I worked on hundreds of projects, but it was pretty rare that we would find a new or previously unrecorded Native American site. It was always sort of a noteworthy and special day when that happened. But then I started working for the Fish and Wildlife Service in refuges and in the Northeast region. And at that time, we had a capacity for in-house archaeological surveys where for smaller projects, proposed projects on refuges, I was able to go out and perform the archaeological testing myself, and with refuge staff and local volunteers. So it's kind of like a mini field school each time. But that was a really wonderful opportunity for me to visit refuges throughout the Northeast region, from Maine to Virginia. And what I discovered was that there is a remarkable the archaeological record on the refuges in the region, and I think this applies to refuges in all the regions of the service. The archaeological record on refuges is quite remarkable and noteworthy compared to the landscape of the region as a whole. And so why is that? In the Northeast, the refuges tend to be located on coastal areas or estuaries or near major rivers, sort of locations that Indigenous people, Native people, favored for settlement over thousands and thousands of years. And so these locations are also very well preserved today. And so I realized that there was this kind of remarkable heritage existing on the refuges, but at the same time, in those days, there was a sense that cultural resources which covers a wide range of historic properties, ranging from Native American sites to historic structures, and can be cultural landscapes, but the cultural resources were seen to be, they were not mission centric. They were not, sort of central to the mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service. They were more like sort of, that was kind of Park Service stuff, you might say. But however, in more recent years, I've seen more of a shift in attitudes and perspectives. There was Partly there was because there were, mandates to attract a greater number and diversity of visitors to refuges. And some people, many people are very interested in the wildlife and natural resources, but there are people who are, more interested in heritage resources, cultural resources. So if there's other ways we could bring in greater visitorship, that would be important to consider. But also, I think there's an increasing sort of appreciation of the Native American heritage that exists within the refuges. And as Eugene mentioned, we have our policies and laws and things we have to do in terms of tribal relations and tribal consultation. But I see a broader landscape of things that we don't have to do with tribes, but we, the Fish and Wildlife Service, but could do or should do. Sort of more proactive, initiative based, and that sort of outreach to tribes enhances our fulfillment of the trust responsibility that we have to the tribes. It's not just the things we have to do, although those are very important. And so there are ways where recognition and awareness of the Native American heritage within the refuges can be an additional way that we can enhance our relationship with the descendant tribes who call those lands their homelands.
Yeah, that's you hit some good points there, Tim. Regulatory is what I consider to be a starting point. These are things that an agency is responsible for doing, and you have to do it regardless of your mission. But it truly is a starting point, and it's a way to think about, a lot of people look at cultural resources as a box that needs to be checked, heritage resources, but in actuality, they are resources that can work. And as we think proactively about them, as you mentioned, the opportunities to use the resources and have them work for us and attract visitors and work for our partners really kind of, is innumerable in terms of where we can go with it.
Definitely. And Eugene and I wanted to mention that folks are welcome to submit. We welcome your questions as we proceed here at any time. If anyone has any questions to submit, we would welcome those.
Yeah. I think, one thing that I often think about with respect to the resources, and Tim, you kind of mentioned it, and I'll just mention it really quickly. Fish and Wildlife Service has some great resources out there, and they really are incredible. Not just in terms of how pristine they can be, but in the kind of depth of knowledge that they can provide, and the periods of history that they touch on. It's really pretty incredible. So this is a great opportunity to kind of to pay them some due, if you will. So.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of programming on refuges, people can really relate to stories about humans, people interacting with their environment, whether it was indigenous people 5,000 years ago, where the refuge is today, or 150 years ago. People are really interested in those kind of stories, and that can really help us tell our story. And so, there's different ways that interpretive programming at a refuge can be effective in terms of connecting with people.
Thanks for sharing so far. I'm wondering if you could answer a question. You've been speaking about refuges, and I'm wondering if there are unrecorded Native American sites on refuges that haven't been captured yet.
Yeah, I can start with that one. The short answer is yes. We have, in fact, the majority, I would say, of resources that are on our lands probably have the greatest number of them have not been recorded, and that's something that we have information on many of them, but not the entire suite of sites that I'm sure occur out on the landscape.
Right, and that sort of highlights the importance of the Section 106 process that we follow on refuges, where we there's a proposed undertaking, say it's a construction of a new visitor center or a trail on a refuge, and we need to consider whether that that project has the potential to affect historic properties. Historic properties being a very wide range of archaeological sites, pre-contact, post-contact, historic structures, and so there are many thousands of Native American archaeological sites have been recorded within the refuge system, but I would say it's just there are many. Most refuges have not had sort of comprehensive archaeological surveys done, which means that there are many, many more aspects of Native American heritage in the refuge system that await discovery. But they merit protection just as much as the sites that are known, that have been inventoried. And so that's why Section 106 process is important to consider the possibility of unrecorded sites and to make sure that there isn't anything there that would be impacted.
Yeah, I think, and some of the sites, many of the ones we have found and worked with have been, pretty significant. And I have one, we see some materials up on the screen now, but I have one area that always sticks in my mind as one of these kind of significant, important sites for various reasons. And the site is it's a reconstructed plank house, the Cathapodal plank house, and I think we might have a picture of it if we get it up here at some point. But that's a significant. That always comes to mind for me when we talk about what might be out there and what is out there, and how does that affect how we think about not only who we are but also our relationship to Native Americans. And that plank house was reconstructed. It was happening just when I started with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it was a type of archaeological site on one of the refuges that Lewis and Clark would have encountered during their trek along the Columbia River, towards the end of their voyage of discovery. And they would have seen these types of plank houses along their journey, maybe even spent the night in one of them. And when I came to Fish and Wildlife Service, there was a big project going on in that region of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And it was, to me, just a wonderful expression of not only the archaeology and history, because the project started with archaeological research on the site, on the Cathapodal archaeological site, but it also ended up in this magnificent partnership between Fish and Wildlife Service leadership, American tribal leadership, and it resulted in the reconstruction of this plank house on the refuge, which is now used for various purposes, educational, tribal, etc. And I always think of that as a great example of, the depth and the way that Fish and Wildlife Service can express itself with respect to these resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, that's a great example of sort of a relationship with a tribe that stemmed from something, sort of archaeological, you could say.
Yep.
But it developed into this sort of partnership that has had all of these benefits that, are really great in terms of, connecting fostering those relationships between the tribe or tribes and the federal lands that the service manages. I think it's really important. I was just remembering another experience I had one time where I was doing one of those archaeological surveys on a refuge, and there was a tribe that lived nearby that had recently received federal recognition. And so we'd invited tribal representatives to come and visit and see this archaeological site that we discovered. And I realized when they were there that, or I learned that this was their first personal meeting with a federal agency since they'd gotten federal recognition. So it was kind of like that was a great feeling. It's sort of history in the making, and so there's things that I find that just as we the more broadly we define the trust responsibility and what tribal interests are, the possibilities for proactive connections to the tribes just expand. Well, they multiply. So and there's things that everybody who works for the Fish and Wildlife Service can do something to respect the trust responsibility, I think. And so it can be, there's actions large and small, but everyone can do something.
Right. So we have a question from the audience. They're wondering, they say that they've tried to reach out to tribal governments near their facility, but they're finding it hard to find contacts. So do either of you have any resources that they could use to contact for their specific area?
Well, yeah, I recognize that the dynamics, in different regions within the Fish and Wildlife Service, that the dynamics between refuges and tribes can be different. There's some, different histories and relationships that go back over time, but in general, there are federally recognized tribal nations, and Alaska Native communities. And then there are tribes and descendant communities that are not federally recognized at this time. The service, we have a special relationship, government to government relationship and trust responsibility with the federally recognized tribes. But we also, need to acknowledge and respect the heritage of non-federally recognized tribes. But our relationship with the federally recognized tribal nations will always be on a certain higher level, government to government. And every federally recognized tribal nation has a tribal historic preservation officer, or THPO, or someone who is a THPO designee. Not all tribes have THPOs per se, but they all have someone who is designated with that responsibility or capacity. And for some tribes, it'll be the tribal leader herself or himself. But many tribes do have THPOs or sort of Section 106 contacts, heritage contacts, and so those would be the primary points of contact for a tribe and someone from a refuge reaching out. But if this person who's asking the question, they haven't succeeded in making that connection yet, I would have to know more, details about, where they are and which tribe it is to try and, facilitate that. And, there are some tribes that, have issues with the Fish and Wildlife Service or with a refuge in their area. So it's not necessarily a simple thing to establish those connections. So we have to, acknowledge that history and the reasons behind it. And hopefully, if we can have, dialogues, improve mutual understanding, that would be a positive thing. I hope that answers the the question. But yeah, the TIPO, it's very important to understand the tribal historic preservation officers. There's an organization, the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, or NAFPO, and you can look that up. And there's a guide to state by state, tribe by tribe. Here's the TIPO. Here's their contact information. And each region of the service has a regional Native American liaison or tribal liaison who should be able to assist in helping identify who the TIPO or cultural resource contact is with a tribe. And each region also has a regional historic preservation officer, and they also should have that information too.
Yeah, maybe we can get those resources. We can attach them to this broadcast and have them available for folks. So.
Mm-hmm.
Super, thank you. So there's another question here, wondering how does the Fish and Wildlife Service protect archaeological sites on coastal lands that are prone to erosion and sea level rise?
Yeah, we do have many sites that are impacted often by environment and changing environments. And I think, again, as Tim mentioned a little bit ago, one of the ways we use the Section 106 process of the National Historic Preservation Act is to understand the kind of sites that are around us, not only perhaps sites that are in the particular project area, but what else is around us, to try to direct us to circumstances that might result in damage or erosion of sites, as mentioned in the question. I think there are a lot of options when you look at this. Sometimes time is of the essence, as you can imagine, because maybe a good portion of the site is already gone. But typically, we try to work within the process to identify the sites, work with our preservation partners, which include Native American tribes and other and state agencies such as the State Historic Preservation Officer, and come up with a plan of action that helps to, in the case of the question, probably excavate and record the site as needed so that we can collect and retain information about the site, even if the actual physical site is becoming compromised. And that's, through that process, we're able to do that. And we have done that many times since I've been in this job at Fish and Wildlife Service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of people are, in terms of the National Historic Preservation Act, people are they're quite familiar. They may be quite familiar with Section 106, which requires us to consider the potential for our actions to affect historic properties and the archaeological heritage. But a little sort of less well known, but also important to consider is Section 110 of the Act, which calls upon federal land managers to basically be aware of all of the cultural resources on the lands that they manage, and to manage them appropriately and to preserve them to the extent feasible. And so that just highlights the fact that there are, archaeological resources known and unknown on the refuges, but that these are, even if they're not seen as being mission centric, they are still trust resources for the American people that we have a responsibility to preserve.
Great, thank you. How do you think we can best inform or train our staff on our trust responsibility?
Well, we have, since I came to the Fish and Wildlife Service, I think one of the areas that's become a focus area for me has been training, and I've said for years that the more people understand and are familiar with cultural resources, heritage resources, and their needs, the easier it is to have a conversation with them about what might have to happen to a particular site or historic property. And so we've had a lot of success with the training center in developing training courses, and we currently have 2 available for anyone really in Fish and Wildlife Service. One focuses on historic preservation and cultural resources, and one focuses on museum property, museum collections. And so those are available. They're online classes. So they're taught, they're scheduled and they have instructors, but the content is available online. We've also worked on some specific workshop projects and training for historic buildings that we've run successfully for the past, I don't even know, 10 or 12 years, where we actually train wage grade staff and give them a little bit of historic preservation training, but also give them hands-on training with historic buildings. And we've partnered with National Park Service on that kind of training. I think, the other part of the question, I think, is speaks to me in terms of some recent thoughts that I've given towards creating a communications plan for cultural resources. I mean, when you think about it, these resources are out on the landscape. They're likely on every refuge and hatchery and other property that Fish and Wildlife Service maintains. And so a communication plan, a plan that describes how staff in any job should be on the lookout in terms of helping preserve those resources is a good thing. And so one of the tasks I've given myself, for the next year, is to try to work with folks in headquarters to develop this kind of communication plan that would touch on, staff writ large within the agency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would add, it's very important, sort of, historic preservation, cultural heritage training and awareness is extremely important. And then there's the tribal trust responsibility more broadly, which the question may have also been referring to. And Fish and Wildlife Service has, Native American policy, and that was updated several years ago. And the National Native American Program saw it, key to the successful implementation of the policy, of the updated policy, was to provide service staff in the respective regions with tribal trust training. And so I know my counterparts in the other regions we've all been developing over the last several years trust training programs, basically, or trainings, and we've been able to present those in person prior to the pandemic. During pandemic times, we've adjusted and sought other means to provide the trainings of those of that kind in the Northeast. We've developed online training videos which are available through a regional tribal SharePoint for service staff. And so, we're being innovative to try and provide that awareness and training to starting with the priority folks who work for the service who have occasion to interact with tribes in the course of their work for the service. So training is increasingly becoming available in the different regions, and we hope to and plan to continue to enhance those and make them more broadly available to people.
Great. Thank you. So kind of switching gears a little bit, but do tribes often think about archaeology when they're consulting about other issues with the agency?
Yeah, I think that they do. There's a lot of examples that I've run across where, a tribe sits down with folks from an agency, Fish and Wildlife or others, and the topic of the meeting is, something like, water rights or sustainability. And I've seen examples where the tribal representatives will stop the conversation to ask about how an archaeological site was handled 30 years before. And it certainly affects the federal staff. A lot of people have kind of readjust because it wasn't the topic of the meeting. But when we think about these trust resources for tribes, they're living resources, and it doesn't matter how we measure time and how we think about projects on these types of sites. A tribe can look at it in a completely different way, and it might be the most important thing they want to talk about when they meet with a federal agency, even though the agenda for the meeting has been developed and focusing on different topics. They can focus on cultural resources, heritage resources, archaeology, and that's their touchstone that they need to have addressed before anything else can go forward.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point, and a really good question. Another example that I've encountered is eagle permits. Say eagle nest disturbance permit. There's a proposed construction project and there's a recorded eagle nest nearby, and so the construction would have the potential to possibly disturb the eagles that are using that nest. And so the applicant applies for a disturbance permit so that they will so that they won't run the risk of sort of violating the law or the regulation. And so the service will reach out to tribes about this permit that's been applied for. And why do we reach out to tribes? It's several things. It's the bald and golden eagle Protection Act, but there's also the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106. And so the tribes, numerous times a tribe will respond with interest or concern about this project or this permit, and they will, they'll have concerns about the eagles themselves, the well-being of the eagles, but they'll also may have concerns about that this project is within an area that's sensitive for Native American heritage, and so there is that sort of duality of concerns that they bring about. So yeah, it can start. The topic can start, or the consultation or discussion can start with something related to the Endangered Species Act or something not, Section 106. But yeah, they may have concerns, about those heritage resources as well. And so we need, in our response to them, we need to address both those things. And that reminded me of something else I wanted to mention, which is that, Eugene mentioned tribes, they have long memories. They're in my cohort coming up in American archaeology was during the NAGPRA sort of era, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. But prior to that, sort of in the 1980s and before, there's a lot of very troubling history between American archaeology and tribes and indigenous people, and that and the tribes' perceptions of archaeologists and archaeology, and those those perceptions could be very negative and for a legitimate reason. And so but I think with NAGPRA was kind of a watershed moment in terms of the national consciousness, or certainly the consciousness of federal agencies, land management agencies, about responsibility and respect for the tribes and for their interests. And so there's still a lot of work to be done, but there has been great progress, I think, in terms of tribal perception of archaeology. And now there are many tribes that have developed their own archaeological programs, which is great. But that being said, tribes may have negative associations with federal agencies and archaeology that can go way back. And so we need to, acknowledge the reasons for that and provide reassurances that this is a new era and a new mindset of, hopefully, cooperation and collaboration.
Thank you. On a different note, you've talked about reaching out to tribes, and can you talk about how you would incorporate tribes into interpretive programming for refuges? Or are there examples of refuges that work with tribes for their interpretive programming?
Yeah, there are.
Yeah.
Sorry, Eugene, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, there are examples of that. And I think I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think it really starts with a refuge or a field station kind of having a vision or an idea of what they want to do. Maybe updated or new exhibitry. It could be something in a visitor center, like exhibits. It could be, trail markers, something like that. It could be some kind of interpretive programming sort of out in the field at a refuge. They'd have to have a vision of what they wanted, and then decide that they wanted to incorporate or acknowledge the indigenous heritage into it. And then it would be, I think, respectfully reaching out to the tribe or tribes that are, whose homelands, ancestral homelands, that refuge is located in, and saying what they want to do. They're interested in doing this, and it would be starting a dialogue, ideally, with the tribe to determine, one, that the tribe was supportive of that, and then to make sure that the information that was used was accurate and used respectfully and appropriately. And so I think it would be, there's no substitute for that sort of personal connection, and a sense of, shared purpose or objective there, that the tribe would, may appreciate their heritage having greater public awareness of their heritage in that area. And the service would be, sort of finding a way to observe its trust responsibility by incorporating that heritage into the interpretation. So I see it as a, sort of reaching out personally and respectfully to the THPO, to the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. And I think they may find that, it would depend on the refuge and the tribe, but it would be one way to sort of foster increased connections between the tribe and the refuge lands. And in terms of examples, I can't provide any right offhand, but they're out there, these sort of regional Native American liaison, tribal liaison, regional historic preservation officer could provide guidance, I think, or examples.
Okay. There's a question wondering if you work with the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society at all.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I think Tim's probably the best one to answer that question.
Yeah, we do. The society there's a lot of sort of common objectives between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. Basically, it hinges on a shared interest in the conservation of native fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats, protecting those habitats, expanding those habitats, and a sense that those are, very, crucial for, conservation is very crucial for the tribes, for all Indigenous people, and that's the mission of Fish and Wildlife Service. So we do attend. The society has, an annual meeting, and we do participate in that, and we try to assist and they also have regional meetings from time to time. And so we definitely try and assist the society with that relationship and, sharing our contact networks and awareness of, hopefully for tribes, of the things that Fish and Wildlife Service can offer to tribes. In addition to those things we talked about earlier that we have to do, there are things we can do in terms of providing, there's grant opportunities for tribes, the Tribal Wildlife Grants Program. There's other funding opportunities through the service. And then there's, technical assistance on their conservation needs, whether it's, fish passage or habitat restoration, invasive species. There's all kinds of sort of ecological services type advice that the service can provide to tribes. but it's a matter of finding out, what the tribe's conservation needs are, challenges are, and what their aspirations are. And if we can find out what those are, we can find areas of alignment between the service's objectives and what the tribe needs and make those connections. And so I think organizations like, the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society is a really key partner for that sort of networking and making those connections.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to ask, what's your favorite aspect about your job, the position that you have today? What would you consider to be one of your highlights?
I think for me, it's been, I think I mentioned earlier that I'm really drawn to training. And I think I've had probably some of my most important and interesting aspects of this job come out during the training. And that's really been through conversations with the Fish and Wildlife Service staff that have taken the training and have surprised me with how much they've been thinking about cultural resource, heritage resource preservation, and how much they're thinking beyond the regulatory component and how to work these resources into the mission of the field station of the refuge or hatchery. And that's humbling, and it makes me feel like that we have a lot of potential out there for growth in this awareness that Tim and I are talking about.
I think for me, the work is very challenging and very rewarding and very fulfilling. I think that it is to be able to help the service and the federal government to, respect and fulfill the trust responsibility to the tribal nations is, I find it very meaningful. And as I mentioned before, I've seen other federal agencies and how they approach the trust responsibility, and I've learned that different agencies have different ways of interpreting it, and some define it more narrowly. The trust responsibility, define it more narrowly to sort of, let's define the things that we have to do. We'll do those, but then we'll kind of leave it at that. But within the Fish and Wildlife Service, I sense that the more imaginatively and broadly and empathetically we can define the trust responsibility and what the interests of the tribes are, that the possibilities for ways we can better fulfill the trust responsibility, they just multiply. It's not like, oh, we had this idea, we did it, we finished it, and we're running out of ideas. It's like talking with the tribes. The possibilities just expand when the more broadly we define the trust responsibility, and the more we learn about what their perspectives are and what their needs are. And so for me, I think it's finding out what the tribe's needs are and making connections with people in the service who can help them to address that. And that it helps the interests of the tribe, and it also there's a synergy there with the promoting the objectives of the service for wildlife conservation. So it benefits both sides.
Okay, great. Well, I want to take this time to thank both of you today for this conversation that we've had, for sharing your knowledge with us. And we really appreciate that you've taken time out of your day to spend with us this afternoon or this morning, wherever our audience may be. And then I did want to provide a reminder that NCTC will continue to host the Tribal Broadcast Series on the third Thursday of each month. Please join us for our next broadcast entitled The Significance of Feathers in Native American Cultures, which will be on Thursday, May 20th at 3 p.m. And thank you everybody for joining us today. Hopefully you found this beneficial, and we will see you on the next one.
Thank you.